My original intention with these videos was to experience games that had positive receptions from critics or audiences at any point since their release. There are so many highly popular games that I have never played, so I thought it would be fun to note my experiences with a title that many had enjoyed thoroughly before. This idea twisted somewhat when I chose to also add games to my list that I had found personally intriguing. Some of those forays into obscurity paid off, while others were merely sidesteps. PN03 is firmly a sidestep. Developed by Capcom and released for the GameCube in 2003, PN03 is a third-person shooter with a focus on giving the player a range of defensive capabilities. 2003 wasn't a particularly strong year for Capcom, as their established franchises were met with poor reviews and low sales. Capcom had recently unveiled a group of 5 titles to be released exclusively for the GameCube that would hopefully drive sales for the console. The first of these games to be released worldwide was Viewtiful Joe, a stylish 2D beat-em-up that was well received critically but didn't sell as well as Capcom had hoped. PN03 was released later that year, and the other 2 games were released 2 years later. The now legendary Resident Evil 4, as well as Killer 7, another popular title. With Dead Phoenix's cancellation, the Capcom 5 became 4. Shinji Mikami and Suda51 steered 2 of the titles to critical acclaim, and the newly formed Team Viewtiful managed to achieve similarly high praise. How is it then that with members of the teams which developed such momentous games, could PN03 end up being as cast aside as it was? Could a member of this prestigious quartet really be considered the one blemish on Shinji Mikami's career? First of all, the presentation is especially bland. Most of the levels are interiors with little to no detail. The palette is white and grey, with an occasional brown level when the game dares to stray outside. These white, plastic panel walls are the vast majority of PN03's environments, and the rooms themselves have uninteresting layouts that are used repeatedly throughout all of the levels. The best layouts are saved for right at the back end of the game, and I doubt many players would stick around for long enough to see them. Vanessa's armor is also white by default. It has wings on the back that keep it from being excessively boring, but the sunglasses she wears are an enormous detractor. The enemies within the game are all robots. This could have allowed for a wide range of interesting looking machines, but there are very few enemy types in total, and they're mostly basic with round, flat surfaces. I think there are many possibilities for what a combat robot could be, especially in this sci-fi apocalypse setting, and yet they're very safe. Spider-bots have been done to death, and the number of different variations on the gunner robot that is incapable of turning is far too high. The music and sounds are also middling at best, but at least there isn't anything awful. The narrative, on the other hand, would have been better left out of the game entirely. The majority of the game being set in a series of corridors that can be arranged in any way that don't have to be cohesive makes the story beats between levels ultimately meaningless. When the client explains the objective to Vanessa, they won't say anything definitive or helpful. Instead, the client will allude to something that must be destroyed, and might show Vanessa an illegible wireframe of the target. Then, the player is tossed into the level, and they won't hear anything from the client until the start of the next level. Furthermore, the narrative events that actually occur within the game can be counted on a single hand. PN03 waits until the 9th level to introduce a narrative element that seems like it would be massively important. Vanessa finds a stasis chamber, the occupant of which seems to be a clone of her. Then, Vanessa's actions during this stage cause it to begin self-destructing, so she doesn't get any time to hang around and contemplate this mystery. The client also barely speaks of it. There's just a clone, I guess. Moving on. Progression in the game is handled in a peculiar way. The player will earn points for defeating enemies and completing rooms, which are then used as currency for purchasing upgrades. Vanessa's suit is supposed to be attached to her spinal cord, but she is able to exchange it for new suits that have a different arrangement of upgrade slots. Health, damage, special charges, and special effects can be upgraded while in a shop menu, as well as something called Automatic, that is only available for a few suits, and I have no idea what it does. New suits don't inherit upgrades purchased for other suits, so in order to take advantage of the new upgrade slots, the player must invest a lot of points into a new suit to bring it up to parity with their current loadout. In order to achieve appropriate power for some of the narrative missions, the player will have to enter the trial missions to earn additional points. Doing this exposes a tremendous failing for the game. Each level consists of a series of rooms that are separated by doors. The doors cause the screen to go dark while the next room is loaded, which is the failing I just mentioned. The rooms don't need to be arranged in ways that make coherent sense. A door could just as easily spit the player back into an identical room to the one they had just left, and it would be a valid level construction. These room arrangements aren't common among the narrative levels, but they are an epidemic within the trial missions. This would make sense at the beginning of the game, as the trial levels are pooled from the rooms that were present within completed narrative levels. As the player progresses the narrative, the trial pool gains more options. Later levels have slightly different visual themes, but the blandness of all of the rooms at least makes this portion of the game less confronting. Instead, trial levels even late in the game can repeat rooms right beside each other, despite having such a wide pool to select from. It would seem like this kind of thing should become rarer as the game goes on, but it still happens. The trial levels also cannot ever have the boss rooms from the narrative levels. There aren't many bosses in the game, and the ones present lack interesting movesets. Some don't even seem like threats outside of the room they're locked within, so the purpose of destroying them is lost on me. The bosses are reused within the narrative levels too, since this game is so readily recycling every other aspect. It is somewhat confusing that these pieces didn't make it into the final recycling portion. The biggest criticisms PN03 received at release were in relation to the controls. I don't understand how Capcom could have produced so many prominent action titles prior to PN03 and still allow the game to have this control scheme. It is atrocious. Vanessa is guided by tank controls. Left stick forward moves forward. Moving the left stick left or right has Vanessa turn in that way, and left stick down moves backward. Except that when moving backward, Vanessa twirls around and covers a tiny distance before having to end the twirling animation and stay still for a moment. She couldn't have just stepped backwards. Apparently it was necessary for this to be the only way to move backward. Using the L and R buttons will cause Vanessa to dodge to the side. This animation is the same as the backward walk, but it covers a larger space. If the same shoulder is pressed again, then Vanessa will perform a cartwheel instead of spinning. Neither of these dodges, nor walking backwards, grant Vanessa any invulnerability frames. She's damageable throughout these animations, so the way the cartwheel animation just leaves her foot hanging in the air means that she's a much larger target than if she had just stood still. It is possible to gain invulnerability frames through the use of special attacks, which makes the lack of invulnerability throughout the dodges even more nonsensical. The tank controls also make dodging to the side by moving a non-option. The A button shoots a basic blast from Vanessa's hands. She is not capable of shooting while moving, and holding the button down doesn't cause the weapon to fire repeatedly. Both of these omissions make the already odd, clunky controls worse. There isn't an upper limit to the number of times the A button can be pressed in rapid succession. Every button depression registers a shot, so it's possible to defeat enemies by mashing frantically enough. This is how I hurt myself. I played for over 10 hours and found that my thumb was suffering greatly from mashing as much as I could. If the automatic upgrade makes a weapon fire repeatedly, it would have been great if that was discernible within the game. The jumping and crouching also have quirks, but they're minor when compared to inputting special moves. The special moves are assigned to certain suits, and require a short sequence of inputs before they activate. These inputs are all done via the D-pad, which means they can't be activated while on the move. Also, the window for the inputs is inconsistent. Sometimes an input could be done a little while after the first, and the game would still perform a special move. Other times, the game doesn't register an input that has been made, and instead the player ends up just standing idly in harm's way. Because of these difficulties, the most effective strategy to progress through the game is to huddle in a corner and step out only when it is safe to do so. So not only are the controls poor, the enemies uninteresting, and the environments bland, but the best way to proceed through the game is to go as slow and conservatively as possible. PN03 is stuck in time. The gameplay sections are archaic, and the visual design is safe aside from Vanessa's embarrassing characterization. It isn't overly long, and everything that Capcom did develop is wrung out so readily that it feels like the game never ends. I don't like Vanessa, or the client, and the personality-devoid robot enemies have no charm whatsoever. Don't play this game. Let it die. I'm sure it won't be missed. I'm going to lighten the tone next time. A silly little management game should be good. Keep apartments in order, spy on the tenants, plant contraband in their home and have the government arrest them. Nice and cheery.